Hello, welcome back to my channel. If you're new around here, my name's Kit, and this is my world. Thank you very much for joining me. In this episode, I'll be doing the first time book tag by Mooni Reads. I'll leave a link in the description. So without further ado, let's get cracking. Question number 1. What is the first full-length book that you remember reading on your own? Not like picture books or anything. Well, it's a short book, but it's not a picture book. It's The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And I read that when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, I believe. Question number 2. What is the first series you remember finishing? Well, it's the Narnia Chronicles by C.S. Lewis. I read all of them when I was very, very young, and I continued to reread them as I got older. Question number 3. What is the first book-to-movie adaptation you remember watching knowing it was a book-to-movie adaptation? Well, this is a very difficult one to answer because I can't bloody remember what I knew or didn't know and when I knew or didn't know it. And that even applies to last week, let alone when I was very, very small. But I'm going to take a shot in the dark and suggest Tarka as a possible contender, because I remember that being one of the earliest movies I ever saw. It's probably the earliest recollection I have of seeing a movie, because it affected me very profoundly. I cried a lot. There was an incident with an old lady and a wig. You can watch my video about books that made me cry if you want to know all about that. But I saw the movie of Tarka first, and then I read the book many years later. But I believe, because I went to see it with my grandma, I believe she would have explained to me about the book upon which the film was based. So I'm going to say Tarka the Otter. Question number 4. Who was your first book crush? Well, there are two. The first one that I'm going to tell you about is Anastasia Krupnik, and I have some of the many Anastasia books here. She starts off, I believe, around 8 years old in this one. And she was cute. She had a cute mind. I was very attracted to her brain and the way she thought. And she's very funny and very intelligent and bohemian. So she was my kind of girl. And then she kind of gets older in each book. She grows up a bit. This is actually my favourite one, Anastasia Ask Your Analyst, and there's Sigmund Freud on the front, and it's kind of a fun intellectual analytical book. So there's Anastasia Ask Your Analyst, and in Anastasia on her own she puts some makeup on, and I remember as a teenage boy finding her very hot with terrible makeup on and dressed up in her mum's clothes, but at the time that was hot. So Anastasia was my girl crush. My boy crush was almost certainly Peter Pevensey from The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. He wielded a sword. Question number 5. Who was your first bookish friend? Ian. I had a very good friend called Ian right the way through my 20s and 30s, and he was very, very bookish, and he liked the same books as me. In fact, we kind of cross-fertilised our book tastes a little bit. He introduced me to Eddings, he introduced me to Terry Goodkind, he introduced me to Jordan and the Wheel of Time. I introduced him to Bill Bryson, I introduced him to Catherine Kerr, and we really loved swapping books back and forth and discussing them endlessly. It was, without a doubt, the best bookish friendship I've had in the real world in my adult life. And me and Ian also used to make music together, we played video games together. It was a really good friendship, but it was very based on books a lot of the time. Question number 6. What is the first adult book you remember reading not for school? So I'm going to be a little bit cheeky and deliberately misinterpret this question. And for adult, I'm going to assume adult. So I'm going to say The Red Book, or The Little Red Book. I think it's The Little Red Book. I'll show you a graphic. I've discussed it before briefly. It's not the first book I read. It's not the first grown-up book I read. It's probably not the first book about sex or sexuality that I read. But it's the earliest one that I remember. I remember being very young when I picked it up off the shelf and read it with a great deal of interest. But no books were forbidden, and so it's a very difficult question to answer. And certainly school didn't enter into my reading life in any meaningful way. Question number 7. Who was your first character role model? Well, there are two. The first one I've already mentioned, Peter Pevensey from the Narnia Chronicles by C.S. Lewis. He was a very cool kid. He was smart, intelligent, he was very grown up and mature. For the most part, he made good decisions, and he was also a warrior and a king. He was a pretty good role model. He was a good sibling as well. And so, yes, everything about Peter Pevensey was kind of something that I aspired to be like. And also I'm going to say Knocker from the Borrobles. Knocker Borroble is heroic. He's heroic, but he's also gritty and grimy, and that was very appealing to me in the early to mid-80s. Question number 8. Who was the first author you were truly inspired by? Well, again, difficult to answer because I was reading a lot of books very early in life, and I can't remember which order I discovered them in and what I was thinking at that time. But I haven't discussed him very much, so I'm going to say Michael de Larrabiti, who wrote The Borrobles, which I just mentioned in the previous question. Michael de Larrabiti was a very interesting character. He was from South London. He had had a career as a documentary filmmaker, as a tour guide. He had done lots of things and had an interesting and colourful life. He was anti-authority, so his books were anarchic and kind of punk rock and angry, and that was exciting for a child. I was maybe 8 or 10 years old when I first discovered the Borrobles books, and they were so anti-authoritarian, as was I, that I immediately clicked and I wanted to be a writer like that. I can't say with any certainty if he was the first, but he was certainly very memorable. Question number 9. What is the first book you remember touching or moving you? Again, I started way too early to be able to remember. The Narnia books moved me, especially, obviously, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. I remember sobbing while reading about Aslan on the stone table, but there were earlier books, and one of them was The 10 Good Things About Barney, which I've mentioned in a previous video. I'm not going to discuss it again now because I will start to cry. But that was earlier than Narnia, and that had a very deep, profound and long-lasting effect on me. Question number 10. What was the first classic you read not for school? And again, bollocks to school. But the first classic I read, I couldn't possibly tell you because I was reading lots and lots of books from very, very early. But I can tell you that I was reading the Narnia books, that's for sure. I read Peter Pan, that's for sure. Wind in the Willows, I loved Wind in the Willows, and I read and reread that book countless times. Also the Swallows and Amazons books by Arthur Ransom, minus a few which I despised and continue to despise until this day. But I read an awful lot of books, children's books, adult books, all sorts of books. There were piles of books everywhere. I grew up surrounded by books, so it's very difficult to pin anything down, but certainly those ones that I just mentioned were an important part of my young life. Question number 11. What was the first YA book you read? Well, YA is something that I have literally only been aware of in the last year. Since booktubing, I'm suddenly aware of YA. It was a completely unknown entity. As far as I was aware, there were children's books and there were adult books, and I never really distinguished between them anyway because I like reading both. But suddenly I'm aware of this fucking annoying thing called YA, and I despise it for many, many reasons. I might make a video about it one day, but I despise it for a certain amount of hypocritical reason because I haven't actually read that much. I've read one YA book that I'm aware of, and possibly older classic books that I've read could now be categorised as YA, but I refuse to do that. They're not. They're classics, or they're children's classics, but mostly they're just classics. So don't you dare call them YA. But anything that is specifically calling itself YA, I haven't read apart from one, which I hated, and it was Every Heart a Doorway by Seanan Maguire, which I have discussed at length in other videos. So YA is not for me, but stuff that could come under the banner of YA, if it's old, I might like it, and I've probably read it and loved it. Question number 12. What was the first ebook you read? Well, this one is a little bit easier to trace because all I need to do is go in my Kindle and have a look. And surprise, surprise, it's the Empire trilogy by Raymond E. Feist and Janny Wurtz. And I know people who have been watching my channel for a while are heartily sick of hearing about the Empire trilogy. But when I made the decision to go from reading real books to reading ebooks, the Empire trilogy was the first thing I bought as a box set to test out my new Kindle and to test the concept of being a Kindly sort of bookish person. And I loved it, and I haven't looked back. So it's an easy one to answer. The Empire trilogy, which I adore and which remains one of my all-time favourite series. And on that note, I think I'll call it a day. Thank you very, very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did and you haven't already, you know what to do. Please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, share, comment, do all the good stuff, and I will see you next time. See you later.